There's often confusion between a Canadian visa, Canadian temporary resident visa, and a Canadian work permit or Canadian study permit or a Canadian visitor record. Are they all one and the same, or are they completely different things that serve different purposes? The answer is that they're all different things. They all serve a different purpose, and you may need one or the other, or both in some circumstances. Welcome back. My name is Donovan Francis. I'm a Canadian immigration lawyer at GOOSELAW Immigration, and we help businesses with their employees' work permit applications and save them from all of the legal hassle. In this video, I want to talk quickly about the difference between a Canadian temporary residency visa and a Canadian temporary residence status document, be it a study permit, a work permit, or a visitor record. Now, to give you a bit of context, not everybody wanting to travel to Canada requires a visa. There are some countries that are defined by Canada's immigration rules as visa-exempt countries, and residents or citizens from these countries are not required to apply for a visa before coming to Canada. So the Canadian government's immigration authorities have a list of all visa-exempt countries and visa-required countries on their website. Many of the visa-exempt countries are going to be European countries. The US and other listed countries are visa-exempt. So their citizens do not require a visa to come to Canada. And so a visa application would not be something that any of these nationals would need to do in order to come to Canada. Instead, persons from visa-exempt countries would apply for something called an ETA, an electronic travel authorization, which is something that requires less effort and less details in order to apply for an ETA. You can apply for an ETA and get it approved almost immediately. The cost is very, very minimal, less than 10 Canadian dollars and so on. So an ETA is very different from a visa in that sense. Now, people coming from visa-required countries are required to apply for their visas ahead of time. Typically, it takes some time for these visas to be processed. It can take a few weeks, it can take months in certain circumstances for a visa to be processed. Now, once a visa is approved, the visa is only good enough to take you to Canada and allow you to land in Canada at an airport or arrive at a border crossing. The Canadian temporary resident visa is not sufficient to allow you to remain inside Canada. In order for you to remain inside Canada, you need something completely different. You need to have a Canadian status document, okay? So the visa is what gets you to Canada. It allows you permission to travel to Canada and land in Canada if you're flying, or to arrive at the Canadian border to be processed, right? However, the visa does not grant you status inside Canada. In fact, typically, if you're arriving in Canada by visa, you are going to be arriving at the airport under most circumstances. Once you land at the airport or at the border, or the port of entry, you are then going to be issued with a status document. So if you're somebody who had applied for a study permit, for instance, inside Canada, then when you departed your home country, you would have had your visa stamped into your passport, but you would not have been issued a study permit, right? Your study permit would have been issued at the Canadian airport when you land, and that study permit becomes your status document. Similarly, if you applied for a work permit and were approved for a work permit, then your visa, which is a separate thing, would have been stamped into your passport, and it would have allowed you to travel to Canada. And upon arrival at the airport in Canada, then you would have been issued your physical work permit. And the same applies for people who are coming as temporary visitors, people who are not planning to work, they're coming as tourists and so on. They too are issued a status document at the port of entry. Now, in that situation, the status document can be what's called a visitor record. More often than not, it is not a visitor. A visitor record is typically something that's printed, but they can be issued a visitor record, or they can be issued a stamp in their passport that says, you know what, you're allowed to remain in Canada for 6 months or 6 days or a week, however long the officer at their discretion determines that you are able to stay inside Canada. Or a visitor may also be allowed to stay in Canada without having anything at all stamped or written into their passport, in which case it means that they would have been allowed to remain in Canada for 6 months, right? But in any event, ultimately, there needs to be some kind of a status document in order for somebody, a foreign national coming to Canada as a visitor, as a temporary resident rather, in order for them to remain in Canada lawfully, they need to have a status document, and this is something that is different from their visa, which they would have required in order to travel to Canada if they're from a visa required country. If they're from a visa exempt country, then they would have applied very quickly for their ETA, their electronic travel authorization, which would have allowed them to travel to Canada, and then upon arrival in Canada, they too would need a status document, whether it be a work permit, a study permit, or a visitor record, or a stamp in your passport, or no stamp in your passport, but ultimately some kind of authorization to remain in Canada temporarily would have been required from the Canadian immigration officer. Okay, so I trust that helps to provide some clarity between the Canadian visa, temporary resident visa, and the Canadian temporary residency status document. I hope you found value from this video. As always, remember to like our videos so others may see more videos like this. Subscribe to our channel and check us out on go.gooselaw.com. Thanks. See you again.